You want to start a hobby, you want to do a little bit of a side hustle, and you're thinking of doing photography. Here, what I'm going to do is actually break down the basics of photography for you to really understand what you're looking at when you're looking at a camera. This episode is numero uno of the tutorial series we are relaunching right now. It's going to be on a playlist, it's going to be awesome. Anyway, first things first is of course the exposure triangle. When you're shooting DSLR mirrorless cameras, the exposure triangle is going to be one of the things to really understand three core values. That's ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Let's start with shutter speed. Shutter speed controls the amount of motion that is in your shot. So for example, at a lower shutter, you're going to have more motion blur. At a higher shutter, you're going to have less motion blur, if any at all. Shutter speed is basically measured in the amount of time that you have your sensor exposed to light, which means you're going to have less light that actually hits the sensor or film that you're using. This will ultimately affect your exposure. But good thing you have two other things that kind of pull the exposure back into the center. The next one we're going to be talking about is aperture. To understand aperture, you really need to look at the human eye. When it's dark, it's going to expand, and then when it's light, it's going to contract. That is essentially what the lens is doing in your camera. How this affects your image is it actually controls the depth of field of the actual shot. So how much is your shot going to be out of focus and have lovely bokeh, opposed to the entire shot being in focus? As a rule of thumb, most lenses are actually sharpest around the f8 kind of area. So if you're shooting landscapes, products, or stuff that is still but you want the highest amount of detail, then shooting at a slightly smaller aperture is actually better. However, if you're doing portraits, shooting at a wider aperture to get that depth allows you to do some really nice stuff. The other thing is with a wider aperture is that you're actually able to shoot in lower light situations a little bit better. Now we've talked about shutter and aperture. The last one is of course ISO. ISO itself stands for International Standards Organization, and it doesn't actually describe what it's actually measuring. Back in the day when it came to film cameras, it was actually measured in ASA, which is the sensitivity of the actual film itself. And in this case, it kind of translates over to digital as well in ISO value. What ISO really controls is the overall sensitivity of the sensor and film. This also affects the sharpness of your images. At a lower ISO, your images are going to be clear. At a higher ISO, your image is going to start introducing grain. Now, in this day and age, some people actually like the grain, but also the other side of it is some people want to control the grain. It's usually better to shoot at the lowest ISO possible, and the best guide for that is really how you're exposing your camera to an actual shot. And the best way to understand the exposure triangle inside of your camera is your meter. When you're exposing for your image, what you'll see is a line in the center and then two lines either side with smaller lines coming in. When it comes to over this side, it's usually overexposed. When it's over this side, it's usually underexposed. Yes, I did flip the image because I got the under and overexposed the wrong way around. When it's in the middle, it's usually perfectly exposed. Now, you don't always have to perfectly expose an image because you may like darker and moodier shots. You may like high key shots. That is really up to personal taste, and it's something you can experiment with. Again, photography is painting with light. It's an art form that is forever changing, and it is very much how you see the world personally. Ultimately, when it comes to photography, what's the most important thing? Just do it. We found the wildlife. Look at all the wildlife. If you like this video, make sure you like, follow, and subscribe if you want to see more. Like I said earlier, this is actually a playlist, so if you just want to click right up here, you can go into the next chapter, which is going to be types of cameras, which is going to be fun, depending if you like your cameras, or if you want to find out a little bit more about cameras, then it's going to be an interesting video. Anyway, I'll leave you there. Have a good day.